So in this video I'm going to show you how to make a ribbed cuff for the Claremont sweater, but of course you could use this technique for any sweater that you may be crocheting. The cuffs are actually crocheted separately in a slip stitch rib, and then they're sewn on afterwards, which is also covered in this video. So the width of the cuff, i.e. the length it adds to your sleeve, depends on how many chains you make. So we're going to start with a slip knot loop on our hook, and I'm also going to leave quite a long tail because I'm going to use that to seam my bit of ribbed cuff. So in this case, because my cuff is 22 slip stitches wide, I'm going to chain 23. So you always need to just chain one more than your desired stitch count, because the last chain will be a turning chain and is not counted as a stitch. And what you want is a nice neat chain. You don't want it too loose, otherwise one edge of your ribbing is going to be wide than the other. So this might need a couple of attempts to get it just right. Once you've done it, once you've got it right, then the next cuff you cast on will be obviously much easier. The first few times I cast this on, I'd made the chain a bit too loose, and then if you have a look at this bit here that I've sort of partially done, what happened was this cast on chain was much too wide in comparison to the rest of it. So this isn't actually too bad once that's been seamed, although this is a little bit, the gauge of the first chain doesn't match the rest. That's actually close enough. But if it's a bit too, if it looks too different, you might need to go down a hook size just for the chain, or you might need to consciously make the chain a little bit tighter and neater. 21, 22, 23. So for this very first row, we're going to work into the chain. And normally I like working in the back ridge, but actually for this slip stitch ribbing, it is best to work through the back loop of the first chain. So the back loop would be, if your work is vertical, you've got the left loop, the right loop, and then the back ridge. If you're turning the work horizontal like this, it's the top loop. So you're not going into the first chain, you're going into the second chain, and you're going into the back loop only, and you're going to slip stitch. So what's important to remember with these slip stitches is that when you pull this loop through, you really need to just give it a little gentle tug just to open up that loop a bit. Otherwise you end up with a stitch that is incredibly tight, and it will struggle to work into in subsequent rows. So you can do that by just concentrating on tilting the back end of the hook down, or by concentrating on tilting this tip up. So whichever analogy works best for you, and then hopefully after a while that will become muscle memory, because slip stitches are generally used as a join. So we tend to make them quite tight because we want a nice neat join and we don't want to really see the stitch. Or a slip stitch is used to help us move along, so it's a kind of transitionary stitch to move across a couple of stitches. We don't often use it as a stitch in its own right, so you do have to kind of reprogram how you're working this if you've never used it as its stitch itself. So just remember to just gently open that loop a tad. So as I said, it might take a couple of attempts to get this looking spot on, but don't worry too much. The important thing is just to start and get the feel for it. So I'm now going into the last loop of the last chain, and you can see the first row looks like. So the key to keeping this neat, and especially keeping the edge, because obviously this is crocheted vertically, so this edge, one of these edges is going to be the raw edge of your cuff, and one edge is going to be sewn onto your work. So the tip to keeping the edge looking nice and neat is to make sure you always turn your work in the same direction. So I'm turning my work clockwise, and by that I mean imagine you're looking down onto your work like it's the face of a clock. The point where your stitch is the center of the clock, and the work is one of the arms of the clock. So if you were turning the work clockwise, you'd be turning the work that way. If you were turning the work anti-clockwise, you'd be turning it that way. But I'm turning the work clockwise, so this is the center of the clock, this is the arm. I'm moving it from 3 o'clock, 6 o'clock to 9 o'clock. I'm going to chain 1, and now I'm going to work into the back ridge of the stitches from the previous row. So in this case with the slip stitch, because it's a very flat stitch, it actually, both parts of the stitch are almost on the back of the, only visible when you flip the work over to the wrong side. So when you're doing this stitch, you will need to tilt the work towards you. So this is now the right side of the work. You need to tilt the wrong side of the work towards you so you can see that black back loop to slip stitch into. So back loop, slip stitch, back loop, slip stitch. So this is what I mean by not making the stitches too tight, otherwise it's incredibly difficult to work into them. But again, this is one of those stitches that's slightly different muscle memory to what you might be used to with other stitches, but the more you do it, the easier it will come, and after a while you'll find yourself working much more quickly and smoothly. So don't be disheartened if the first couple of rows don't come too easily to you. So I'm going to carry on working in the back loop only with a slip stitch, and I'll meet you back as I'm coming back up to the end of this row. So as with most of these kind of crocheted working front and back, i.e. working flat, the main point where you're going to lose a stitch is the first and last stitches. So here you can see the last stitch can be a bit difficult to find, but there's the front loop and there's the back loop. And what I'd always say is, if you're unsure whether you need to make another stitch, just count the stitches you've already made. I know it sounds really obvious, but from having taught for 8 years, it's still amazing how many people just don't count and then still wonder why they're losing stitches or have too many stitches. So 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16, 18, 20, 22. So that's perfect. So I don't need to make any more stitches, and that looks okay at that side. So obviously you don't need to count every single row, but as you're getting familiar with this particular stitch sequence and also getting familiar with what the ends and beginnings of the rows are supposed to look like, it is really worth your while counting your stitches just to make sure you're on track with and not missing any stitches or making too many. So let's make row 3. So again, we're going to turn the work clockwise. So remember, this is the center of the clock. You could see these, the work as the arms of the clock. Currently on this side, the work is at 3 o'clock. Move it through 6 o'clock, move it to 9 o'clock, chain 1. And again, remember to tilt the work forward slightly so you can see that the top of the slip stitch row you've just made. And remember, that's the chain you've just made, and you're only going to be slip stitching into the back loops only. So that's basically the sequence. It's pretty straightforward. You're only slip stitching into the back loop of every stitch. You just got to take a little bit care. The last stitch, remember to pull that little loop up a bit just to make sure it's not super tight. And the other thing I would say is that it takes quite a few rows before you get that kind of stretchy effect. So if you do maybe 4 or 5 rows and you're thinking this isn't, I don't think this is working, bear with it. You do need to make a reasonable amount of fabric before you get that. At the moment you can see not really any stretch going on. In this piece I've made a few more rows, and you can see that the more rows you do, you start to get that stretchy effect. So I'm going to carry on making this with the original cuff. The first cuff I made, I basically just kept crocheting and every now and then wrapping it around my wrist to see what the fit was like, because what I want is a fit where there's it's not too loose and not too tight. I want it to be a little bit too small just to get that kind of grip feeling on the wrist, so it's not too loose. And for the cuff, the previous cuff I made, I ended up doing 60 rows of slip stitch. So I'm going to carry on with this, and when I've done 60 rows I'll come back and show you what it looks like. So here is my cuff that I've done to the correct size, and I've basically just done that by as I was making it, wrapping it around my wrist every now and then to see when it was the right size. And actually this is the second cuff I've made, so all I've done with this one is just done the same number of rows as for the first cuff, which was 60. And the way you can count that is that each one of these fat ridges here is actually 2 rows, because you've got sort of 1 row behind and 1 row in front. So starting from here, we've got 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16, 18. So you get the gist. And then when you get to, so this is an even number, but you can tell an odd number because you'll have one sort of skinny row at the end. On this cuff, I have actually made a bit of a mistake because I did this while I was watching TV. So I've actually, don't know if you can see here, it's where I've caught a different wrong part of the stitch as I was crocheting. So all I'm going to do is just make sure that that is on the inside of the work, or on the inside of the cuff, because it actually looks okay on the other side. So because this is reversible, I would just double check that you're picking the best side in case you made any mistakes. So first things first, I've got one long tail and then one really long tail. So this really long tail I'm going to use to join onto the sweater, and this shorter tail I'm going to use to seam the 2 sides of the cuff. Now there's obviously quite a lot of ways of doing this. I'm just showing you the way I've done it. If you've got, you could actually attach this, if you haven't seamed your sleeves yet, you could attach this to the unseamed sleeve, and then you could seam the cuff and the sleeve all at the same time. Because there's quite a big discrepancy between the width of my particular design and this cuff, I've decided to seam the sleeve and the cuff first, because it makes it a bit easier. So to join is a very basic whip stitch. So again, remember, I want this slight mistake or a unique feature, some like to call it, on the inside of the cuff. So when you're joining something, you have right sides together with a whip stitch, right sides together. Don't want to use that long bit, I want to use this short bit. So I've got right sides together. I'm going to thread my needle, and then with a whip stitch it's nice and easy. Just make sure you find I'm going to go through the back loop of this last stitch, and then I'm going to go through, that's actually the first stitch, the last stitch. I'm going to go through the back loop, and then probably this, can you see here, I've got this last row, or the first row, I don't know which one it is, I've got a front loop and a back loop. I think I'm going to go through the back loop of that one as well. So I'm going front to back. You can go back to front as well, so you could go back stitch, front stitch, but you just have to make sure you do that the whole way. And this is completely personal preference. It actually gives exactly the same effect. So I'm going front, back, and I'm just matching stitch for stitch, front, back. And what I'll do is, once I've done a couple, to pull that tail out a bit more, front, back, I'm just going to flip it over and see what it looks like, because if it doesn't look good, I can just pull it out and do it in a slightly different way. So let's have a quick look. Yep, I'm pretty happy with that. If you find you don't like the way that looks, then try picking a different part of the stitch. So maybe you decide to go through both loops and then both loops of this one, or maybe this little back ridge in the loop. So, you know, everyone's crochet is different, everyone's sewing is different. Don't be afraid to experiment and do it in a way that looks best for you. So just carry on doing your whip stitch, front, back. It should match up perfectly, as long as you didn't lose any or increase any stitches in the making. Or sometimes when you're sewing, especially right now because I'm talking, it might be that I've accidentally gone through one stitch more than once, or skipped a stitch even. So hopefully I have got 2 left. 1, last one's a bit baggy. For the last one, I think I'm going to catch in two strands there, just because I don't want that being weak. And in the last one I'm going to go through twice, just to make it a little bit more secure. Let's just double check that again, see what it looks like on the right side. That's pretty good. Don't forget, this will be on the inside of your wrist anyway, so it's not massively visible. You can still see there's a seam, but it's nice and neat, and that's, for me, that's perfectly acceptable. So now I'm just going to actually go, I've done a double stitch, and now I'm going to actually catch that stitch again. I'm going to sew through it. This is just to secure it rather than tying a knot. Can you see that little stitch I made there? I'm going to split that with my needle. Now this is like, if you ever want to undo that, it is a bit of a nightmare, but it does make it quite secure. And now I'm going to weave my end in up these one of these sets of stitches here, because I want this out of the way when you can weave this in any way you like. I just like to catch one of these loops and just run it up there. So that shouldn't be going anywhere. I've done a double stitch and then I've trapped in that double stitch by sewing through it. Now I've run this up one way a little bit. Let's also run it down a couple of stitches. The trick with sewing in ends is to go one way and then another way, back the other direction, not necessarily through the same stitches. If you do go through the same stitches, catch a tail, otherwise you're just undoing what you're doing. But here this helps distribute the bulk of that thread. So there is a little bit sticking out there. It doesn't really matter, that is on the inside of the cuff and that will not be seen. So there we are, that's now ready to sew onto my sweater. So next up, for sewing on a cuff like this, you'll need a couple of pins, bit of scrap yarn, or even just normal sewing thread, but in a colour that's distinguishable from what you're sewing onto. A nice wool needle with a sharpish tip, and obviously a pair of scissors. So you can, this is the best option. Sewing on is the best option when you've got a cuff that's considerably thinner than the edge of your sleeve. If there's hardly any difference, then you can actually crochet the cuff directly on. But here I'm showing you what to do when you need to sew on the cuff. So first of all, we are going to prepare our sleeve. So because we're going to be whip stitching this onto this, we want to be working on the wrong side. So first we need to turn the sleeve inside out. Going to turn the sleeve inside out, and your cuff should be right side facing. Make sure you've got this long tail that you're going to sew with at the top, and then you're going to slot that cuff inside the sleeve. So you've got your sleeve inside out and you've got your cuff the right way round, but with the bottom end of the cuff pointing up, because we're going to sew that in, and then when you turn it inside out, everything will be the right way. So this is the bottom of the cuff, right side touching the right side of your sweater. So join up, match up the side seam of your cuff with the side seam of your sweater, which is not there actually. The side seam is here. Here's my side seam, a lot of ends here, and the middle is about there. Middle is easy with this one because we've got a bit of thread. So the first step is just to add a pin there, just to secure that. So next up, you're wanting to find the halfway point of your cuff. So you've pinned it, you're going to fold the cuff. There is half the cuff. And with this particular sleeve, I've got 3 motifs, which means halfway is a 1.5 motif. So that's easy to spot with this because I've got a whole motif there, I've got a whole motif there, and then I've got a whole motif here. In the middle of that whole motif is where the ring was, so I can easily match that up with that. This doesn't have to be super precise, so don't get too worried about this. You'll just try and best as you can to match it up. It doesn't have to be perfect stitch by stitch. So that's halfway there and halfway here. So what you'll see is obviously there's a considerable difference in the amount of fabric between the cuff, the actual cuff, and the edge of the sleeve. So what I need to do is do a running stitch along my sleeve to match it, so that I can then gather the thread and match it to the cuff. So it does seem a bit convoluted, but it's not that difficult. The most difficult thing really is managing all these ends. So let's thread with our scrap yarn. I'm just going to run, so I'm not going to sew into the, I'm not going to treat this like I do when I'm crocheting. I'm actually going into the sides of the stitches, just because it gives a little bit more security. So I'm going to start near the start, as close as I can get, and the first thing I'm going to do is just do the tail ends are quite annoying actually, so you just got to be a little bit careful with that, not to get yourself into a pickle. You can sew them in first if you like, but as I said, I prefer sewing them into edges and borders and stuff. So actually you could have probably sewn those in. I'll probably regret not sewing those in, but I'm just going to carry on. So leave a longish tail, go back on yourself to make a double stitch, and this is, I might even make a treble stitch there. It's just I don't want this to come undone when I'm pulling the gather. So that's that, and then let's just do a running stitch. This doesn't have to be perfect, they're quite large stitches. You're just going down into the edge of the crochet stitch, up into the stitch. Down, up, down, up, down, up. Down, up. These don't have to be neat, they don't even really have to be, you know, matching in size. It's just, we need to get, it's just enough so you can gather it a little bit. Okay, so we've done the first half there, come to the next pin. So what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to pull that thread until that fabric is the same length as the cuff. Can you see how that's created like a little gather, a little gathering there? And now that is nice and easy, it even matches that. So now I'm going to get my third pin, and I'm just going to pin through a part of the motif that's quite sturdy. So this single crochet round is quite a good one, and this is just to kind of fix that in place there. So I'm going to move on to gathering the other half. So again here I'm just going to put in just a little double stitch, just so that next time I come to gather the other half I'm not accidentally pulling this side tight as well. So this is just a little like a little lock really, I suppose, locking that section in. Okay, here we are. Now same for this side, down and up, down and up, down, up, down, up, down, up. I mean, if you're bold, you can just try sewing it straight on, but I think this technique does give a really nice, neat, professional looking result. Can I fit in one more? Down and up. Alright, let's have a little look. Let's have a little look here. Let's pull that tight. And just make sure you're distributing that gather evenly and that it's not all puckered up in one spot. A little bit more maybe. Too many ends. Just check it matches. As I said, this isn't a precise art, so you know, as long as it looks okay, that is the main thing to worry about. Right, let's just pin that securely in place in one of the parts of the motif that's nice and solid. So that's that single crochet row, and now I'm just going to do a double stitch on the end here, just to make sure it's not going to come undone while I'm sewing. There we go. Just trim that off. So if you want, you can stick a few more pins in there. I might put one more each side actually, and maybe have them pointing down, less likely to stab yourself. That's a bit blunt, that one. And then I might put one here as well. Okay, get my wool needle back, and now to find the end that I saved for sewing. Don't worry if you didn't save an end, and just cut a length of yarn that you think is going to fit. That'll be long enough. And usually, I usually do it about 5 times as long as what I actually want to sew. Let's thread that needle. And again, now we're just doing a whip stitch, and same thing, you can go back to front or you can go front to back. So I'm just going to go front to back. So I'm going to treat each stitch, crochet stitch, as if I was crocheting it. So remember, you're on the wrong side, so you might need to just tilt it forward a bit to see both loops of the stitch. I'm just going to go into that one first. So I'm going to pick up 2 loops of the stitch, and then I'm going to sew into the edge of the cuff. And again, for the very first stitch, just for a bit of security, I'm actually going to do a double stitch there, front to back. I know it's already attached to the work, but okay. Next stitch is there, and now I'm going to have to decide which part of my cuff I'm going to be sewing into. So I want to be catching 2 threads again. So if you look at the edges, there is kind of like a little ridge running along, and there's one element of the ridge that sticks up more than the other, and I'm going to sew. It's easier to see here. Can you see there's a bit that sticks up and a bit that dips down, a bit that sticks up. So I'm actually going to sew onto, you can choose whichever part you want as long as you're consistent. So I'm going to go into the top bit of that ridge. And then I'm just going to sew all the way around. I'm going to go into every one of these single crochets because I don't want any holes there, and that's what will help it look the neatest. When you get to the pins, you can take the pins out because it makes it easier to see what's going on. I'm going to take that pin out because it's at the beginning and I've already I've already sewn that. Keep your tail ends out of the way and just take it nice and steady, stitch by stitch. Sewing into your cuff, and again with the cuff, just make sure you're catching at least 2 strands. In fact, you don't really want more than 2 strands, but you definitely want more than 1. If you catch 1, it can pull it. So I'm just matching up the stitch on the cuff and just making sure on the sleeve edge with the cuff. There won't be a perfect stitch for stitch match in terms of one ridge matching one stitch unless you miraculously ended up with the same amount. So if you had 60 rows and you had 30 ridges and you ended up with 30 stitches on your sleeve edge, but unless you deliberately planned that, which you could if you wanted to, it's not going to be a perfect match. And again, as I said, you know, this isn't, once you've done this and you've turned it inside out and it doesn't look right, you can come up with another tactic. So maybe you could try putting a row of single crochet first on the cuff as well as the edge of the sleeve, to make the joining up much neater. There's lots and lots of different options that you could try, and this way is just one way of doing it. So I'm going to carry on, and I'll meet you back when I've get back to the beginning of the seaming. So I'm just coming to the end, and I'm going to finish off with a double stitch, and then I'm going to just actually tie a knot because I don't want to, I want to see what it looks like first before I sew the end in, so that I got the option to undo it and try something different if it doesn't look right. This has been overused now, and so to make a knot I just do another stitch. Let's find the end of this. Make another stitch, but I keep the loop large, and then I'm just going to pull the tail end through the loop. Okay, right, next step is to remove the tacking that you used to make the gathers. So it might be a combination of cutting where you've put the double stitch. Let's just very carefully, obviously you don't want to be, you can also use a pin to help loosen these. Should be enough for me to get my scissors in now. Okay, should be able to pull that out now, apart from where I did a double stitch at the halfway mark. I'm just going to cut each side. Pull out the tacking, a little bit left here, a bit of blue fluff. Okay, moment of truth. We need to flip, turn our sleeve the right way round. Let's see what it looks like. So, here we are. That looks really good. I'm pretty happy with that. Matches the other sleeve nicely. In fact, I think I did a better job on this second sleeve than I did with the first sleeve. Hopefully no one will be looking too closely to see that. There's a few little bits of blue fluff in there, which I can get rid of, but overall, pretty pleased with that. And so now I'm good to just sew in all those last ends.